Okay. And for some reason my go live here is not.
Yeah, same.
Give me 1 second. All right, there we go. Now it just showed up. And now I can hit go live on my Instagram. Okay. I'm gonna wait till Darcy, were you able to get yours to go live?
Yep, I'm live now.
Fantastic. Well, anyways, Ari, you were saying that we have already some questions, which is fantastic. But what we were going to do is we were planning on starting the session off like we normally do, where we start with questions. But something really interesting happened in the last 2 days, and that is Alabama Supreme Court made a decision that has potential consequences that are so scary in ways that we haven't even thought about, and we're actually talking about them tonight. I don't think anyone's really had time to process it. And so we wanted to talk about that tonight, and then we'll also still answer questions. We'd love anyone who has questions about this, especially if you're from Alabama. That'd be great to kind of know what you think. But I'm going to let Dr. Salem at least start first with this, and then we'll kind of go with the questions and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this is definitely something that's been on many people's minds in our field and everybody that's kind of in the peripheries of our field. So I thought maybe what I'd do just very briefly for anybody that, kind of hasn't read the story, I'll just kind of introduce it very briefly. I mean, there's a lot more detail than this, but effectively in Alabama, there was a case in which what's alleged to have happened is that a person accidentally or kind of inadvertently went into the IVF lab, and that led to an accidental episode where embryos were destroyed. Now, it's hard to know if they were dropped or kind of what the details were. Why is that person in the lab if they're not supposed to be in there? And we'll get into that in a moment. But I'll just kind of fast forward a little bit here. The Alabama Supreme Court ended up ruling that that this was actually going to be tried as a manslaughter case, and it was because of negligence of the clinic that it was going to be tried as a manslaughter case. And ultimately, the really important take-home point is that the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that the embryos would be treated as children, as effectively as unborn children, but have the same sort of stature as children. And of course, there are many problems with that. But that's really the big, kind of the foundational point here that has everybody in the field talking and kind of very concerned that embryos are being considered unborn children, because that has so many implications. And Dr. Amos and I are going to just kind of chat a little bit about that. But I don't know. I mean, what are your first impressions of this, Dr. Amos? Just big picture.
Yeah, so the funny thing about me is I love law, and I'm a very objective, analytical person. So whether I like a ruling or dislike a ruling, I love the law behind it, because one, that tells me if it's ever going to be overthrown by the Supreme Court or something like that. So is it sound, right? And the first part of me as a fertility doctor is I'm going, what the hell? I mean, the implications that we haven't even talked about yet are, how can you freeze embryos? If anything happens, if an embryologist just accidentally does something wrong and now all of a sudden the embryo is lost, which is horrible to begin with, then the clinic could actually get sued and for murder. I mean, basically that's what it is. It's wrongful death of a minor. And obviously, I think there are major ramifications of that, because one, we could end up being like some countries where they don't freeze embryos and they freeze eggs. And so no one wants to freeze embryos anymore, because why would you want the risk? And in a country where, I mean, when you really look at it, if you look at some of the amount of money that are given away in lawsuits now, I mean, it's insane. I mean, people, little things get 32 million, Trump sued for 464 million. I mean, the amounts are so high. We're in a country where it's just too risky. So at that point, it scares me. It scares me too what happens next. I mean, when you think of like Plan B, Plan B is not an abortive factor. No baby has ever implanted yet for Plan B to work. And yet, based off of this definition, an unborn baby is anything that could potentially become a baby. And so you're talking about now Plan B theoretically could be used as wrongful death. And so now can boyfriends go after girlfriends who take Plan B? I mean, it's just from a clinical standpoint, I'm going, this is crazy.
Yeah.
It doesn't even make sense to me. So then I went back and I looked at everything. I actually looked at like the decision. I looked at the dissent. I think it's always important for people to understand that judges, at least, are not supposed to, let politics get involved in this. And so for a judge, they're not making a law. A judge is interpreting law. And so in this situation, as you pointed, in 1872, they made this law that was supposed to protect born and unborn children. Now, I think you and I can both agree that what they meant by unborn was probably babies in the womb. Now, again, regardless what you think about abortions or not, it doesn't matter. What we're talking about is a definition right now. And so we were talking about this right before. I said one of the things that the first thing came to my mind was the Second Amendment, because there are people who argue that, hey, the guns we have today are not what they had back then. And so people argue shouldn't have a Second Amendment now. We shouldn't be able to have guns because of the reason that they never intended that, right? And this is actually a very similar argument that this judge is making. The judge is saying, well, listen, at that time, they must have thought this, so this is why this is true. Well, the problem is that if you use that analogy of the Second Amendment, at least the Second Amendment tells what the purpose of it was for, right? They at least know that they didn't think their military was always going to stay with muskets, right? So at some point in the future, they knew they were going to have better guns. And so they could make the argument that, no, they knew there were going to be better guns. But what's crazy about this is that who would have ever thought a baby would be in a petri dish? Who ever thought a baby would be frozen? I mean, it's just insane. And so the court is saying, again, not determining whether it's right or wrong, but saying that in 1872, they must have meant the same thing, which is insane because we didn't even understand biology as well as we know now. We didn't even understand those things. So to be able to take that and the judges, and again, 7 out of 8 judges, which is insane. Like 7 out of 8 people sat there and said, this makes sense. Definitely in 1872, that's what they were thinking. Like, it's just, I can't believe people educated could have made that. Or versus if he would have said, yes, there is concern here, and there could be some application, but would have said, but we can't know what they were thinking back then, so we're not going to change it now, and then let your current Congress, your current local government make decisions then, and then that can be decided. I mean, again, any state can still make this law if they want. What's so insane about this is that for somehow a court thought that in 1872 they were thinking ahead how we were going to have embryos frozen in vitrification, which by the way just started in the last decade, and knew this stuff ahead of time. And it's just insane. And that's why I think it will get overturned. I think there is no chance of this standing. I don't care how conservative a court is. I think when you get to those higher levels like Supreme Court and stuff like that, I do believe there's a little bit more prudence to think about those things and not just guess, But again, I'm hoping I'm wrong because this could change. It really could have implications everywhere. I mean, because I'm not even thinking just from the standpoint of Alabama, right? There's lots of conservative states, right? I mean, and most conservatives, the funny part about it is most conservatives don't believe this. I have tons and tons of friends who are 100% pro-life. They don't believe there should be any type of abortions, and yet 100% of them are perfectly fine with embryos being discarded, even though they're against that because they don't see it the same. I think most people don't, and that's why this is just so profound. And anyway, I've been talking, but from an analytical standpoint, I understand where they made their decision. I just don't understand how they came to that decision, because why would anyone think in 1872 they had any clue what we're doing today?
Yeah. You know, the really sad thing is that we're already seeing repercussions of this ruling. We already have the University of Alabama that has effectively postponed their IVF program, or kind of, at the very least, they're going through with retrievals, from what I understand, but maybe freezing eggs. They're not creating embryos right now. So
Yeah.
there are patients, there are very real people, couples on the other end of this that are now having to hold on their treatment cycle to have their baby. I think the other really dangerous part in all this is when we think big picture about how this could affect fertility and how it would affect our field of IVF. I mean, it would absolutely gut the efficiency of being able to do IVF if you can't freeze embryos, because now you can't effectively do pre-implantation genetic testing, or if you can't, if you have to transfer every single embryo that you ever make, that means you have to make less embryos. That means you drive the costs of IVF up through the roof because you decrease the efficiencies by which you do this. Ultimately, we're trying to create more access to IVF, and this would actually push us in exactly the opposite direction. It would create a lot less access by making IVF extremely expensive. And would really kind of leave a lot of people on the sidelines as it comes to this type of treatment. There is a precedent for it too. It's not like this has never happened before. I think one important precedent is the policy in Italy that happened, I believe, in 2004. And what we saw happening in Italy is that they said you actually couldn't you couldn't fertilize an egg and then not transfer the embryo later. So what clinics ended up doing is they would do the retrieval, they would only fertilize 2 or 3 eggs, and then freeze all the rest of them. And they would hope that those eggs would make it to that, blastocyst stage, or to the day 3 stage. And then they would transfer whatever it is that they had that survived. So in that case, they came up with a workaround for the policy, but it was very, very expensive. Now, when we think about that policy, though, I can't help but think, what would happen if this ruling were to hold in such a way that embryos now that don't survive in the lab, is the IVF center now responsible for not discarding those embryos as well, the ones that arrest in their cellular development as they're going from just a 2-cell to the blastocyst stage? Or do you have to transfer every embryo that you then have at that point? And that pushes us back in many ways. It's kind of to the old times of IVF, before we got more precise about it, before we got better about transferring as just a single embryo to have a single baby, which is the healthier outcome for mom and baby. So many implications here, I think, that if this ruling isn't overturned, could really dramatically change IVF in Alabama, and maybe even some other states, if other copycat states try to do the same thing.
Yeah, Italy is a great one that you brought up. I mean, that's really mostly the reason why we're able to freeze eggs today, is because of Italy, because they had to get around this, and most of the advancements we've had is from them. And your point, I think, even goes beyond other states. I mean, I think we forget sometimes that once a law becomes something, right, it kind of goes across the country. So let's say, for example, not every state may have a personhood law, which so far personhood laws have really not been supported. I mean, they really don't do very well, where you're actually giving the embryo the right to life. So this is what's so strange about this. But it may not be the whole country can't freeze embryos, but there could be in certain local areas, right? They can make laws against. They can make laws against different things. So I've never really truly thought we had to have a Congress make a law that protects, us as fertility doctors. But at some point we may need that, because you're right. I mean, it's going to create problems. So I think let's go for each one of those things, because I do think there are down effects of what you said. So let's just talk about cost. So let's talk about how we think it would affect cost. So you mentioned one, you can't freeze embryos anymore, which means every IVF cycle is needed to be able to procreate if you want to make embryos, right? Now, if you can sit there and say, well, we freeze eggs. Well, again, so now we're freezing eggs. And the problem with that is you don't know the quality of those eggs. So, for example, someone who's 40 those eggs probably aren't that good, right? So if they get pregnant, let's say on that transfer, they may end up in the future not being able to use those eggs because they're not that good, and then they can't go through again. They would have maybe banked up embryos. So a couple of things: cost. What do you think? I mean, let's start there and talk about cost. Where are other areas you think that it could really make the cost go up?
Well, I mean, one place where the cost would definitely go up is on the whole healthcare system, because you're going to end up transferring more consistently more than one embryo. So we're going to go back to the age where twins and triplets were more common. That's been a huge innovation in our field. The fact that we've been able to transfer one embryo and feel very confident about it and get a really high success rate. Now, if you have to go back to transferring 2 and 3 embryos all the time, even among very good prognosis patients, what you're going to see is a higher multiples rate, a higher rate of preterm delivery, preeclampsia, and a higher rate of babies, unfortunately, in the NICU. Every baby in the NICU is a very, very high cost, a very sad thing if avoidable. I mean, it's wonderful that NICUs exist, but if we can avoid that admission to the NICU, it would save the healthcare system a ton of money. I mean, that's just one example that would stem from having to do transfers of 3 embryos, let's say. How about you? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, down the same line. I mean, you make a really good point. I mean, it's where we're at now. It's so much different than past. I mean, I remember the days of like they did transfer after transfer, and it just didn't work. I mean, my wife and I, when we went through 2 embryos, we put back 40% chance, best chance. Now 1 embryo, 60% chance with PGT testing. I think there's also the point where you're talking about the healthcare system is having a child with a problem, right? So, I mean, there are people who do PGTM to, rid diseases from their family, right? And that's going to prevent a child from having that. So now, if you can't freeze embryos, how do you test these? And then you go back to like the old days of fresh, where you try to test, and then 2 days later you go and you put it back, but again you have to discard some of those embryos, and so then you run into that problem again. So I mean, you basically get rid of PGT, you get rid of PGTM. So people now who want to rid their family of diseases or have a disorder that can hurt their child, they can't do that. You have people who have recurrent miscarriages due to translocations of their DNA. What are you going to do there again? How are you going to do this? The cost even to the patient, if you said, well, we're going to have to do only 1 or 2 embryos at a time, it'd be so costly. I mean, labs, the way they're able to keep costs down is running multiple cycles at the same time. Now, if you're only able to run 1 embryo or 2 embryos at a time, they're not going to be able to run the volume they do, and cost goes up in that. I think the other thing is legal, like when you start thinking about costs, like regards to like malpractice, stuff like that. Now, if we're now open to, again, I don't know what the charge is for what the crime is in Alabama. But the point is, if it's really high, our malpractice goes up. Our malpractice goes up, then prices go up. I mean, it has implications I don't even think we've thought of. I mean, we're even doing this very early, this talk. Mm-hmm. A week from now, we may have a completely different perspective once we start thinking of some of the other things that will go through our heads. I mean, we're just starting the basic. Anything else you can think of when it comes to cost? And I think then the next thing we talk about is how does it affect preservation, for people?
Yeah. I think another thing that comes to cost, and you kind of touched on this, is, if we go back to this idea of you can't fertilize too many eggs at the same time because you don't want to create embryos because you're worried about the implications of that. What you're going to have to do each time is you're going to have to thaw 3 eggs at a time, fertilize those 3 eggs at a time. So you're kind of going through all those pieces of IVF in the lab individually. Instead of doing it all together, you're doing it in series. And that would increase the cost a lot, but it would also increase the emotional cost to the patients and the time, because it's going to take us longer to get that good embryo, or longer to get, again, when we do IVF, we look at all the embryos morphologically, and we look at all of the embryos via the lens of PGTA if we do that. So those are 2 really good screening tools to come up with the best embryo to transfer. But if now you only have 3 embryos at a time, you're going to be transferring lower quality embryos just statistically. So, really, it's going to take us longer to get to a pregnancy, in addition to all these increased costs. So I think there's going to be an emotional burden, even for people doing it kind of by the book in Alabama, again, if things hold like this.
Yeah, and I was just talking about, for preservation, as you talked about cost of, being able to go through and get a bunch of eggs at one time, and then, having to now freeze eggs. There's also adding risk, right? Because now you add a step, and when you freeze eggs, sure they thaw great, but you added a step now. So now there's another step there where you have to thaw the egg. Does the egg thaw, and then you get the sperm, and so adding that step lowers your chances as well. So being if you start with 12 eggs and you do normal IVF and you start with 12 eggs and you freeze them, there is a slight decrease by freezing those 12 eggs first and then thawing them again. Not huge, but again, it is a decrease. Now people can't preserve. So people who are older and say, hey, I want to be able to preserve my fertility, it will cost people more money, because one thing I always tell people is that you only freeze eggs if you don't know who your partner is. You know who your partner is, you freeze embryos. There's no reason to freeze eggs. The problem with eggs is always the ingredients. I always tell people it's like buying a cake from Cheesecake Factory versus buying the ingredients to make a cake from Cheesecake Factory. So if you're only starting with ingredients, you have no idea what you have. And so what's going to cost people more money is now they're either going to have to now make, take 40 eggs now, because now they're not looking at from the standpoint, can I just have one kid with other kids? Whereas at least you freeze embryos and you do PGTA, you can say, I have 6 euploid embryos. I know I'm going to at least get so many pregnancies out of this. And it's a burden on everyone. And when you talk about accessibility, this just kills accessibility now, because now, people are going to be able to afford it. What other things do you think of? I'm trying to think of like other stuff that I was looking at some of the questions here, and people were in the background saying like, how much a heartache it would be, and talking about the transportation. I really, like I said, I just wonder what you think other things. I'm like in my head trying to think of some of the other stuff that we have to be worried about as a fertility clinic. I mean,
I think one thing that comes to mind in this specific case, and again, I just when I read this line in the news article, and it's a very ambiguous line, I was like, gosh, this doesn't sound right. And it was this idea of, okay, how did, in this very specific case, how did this happen? And they said that basically somebody, walked into the lab that wasn't supposed
yeah,
to be there, and inadvertently destroyed the embryos. And I mean, this,
just drop
first
them.
of
Yeah,
all, yeah, this, to a fertility doctor, and to us who kind of are very, very, very careful about the labs that we run and everything, it just doesn't pass the whiff test. Usually labs are very, very extremely secured,
yeah,
very, very high fidelity locks with kind of encrypted systems, so that not basically nobody can get into the lab except if you have a code. You're supposed to be there. It's logging every single person who's coming in and out of the lab. Many have different types of monitoring systems. So, they kind of, in the article, they made it seem like somebody just kind of strolled in there, and that doesn't sound right. Like I think there's probably more to that story that maybe the journalist didn't catch. So I want to make sure that, that whatever site this happened in, that, they don't get mislabeled for something like that, somebody just strolled in there. I think there's probably more to that story. But, another piece of all of this, it has to do with storage, embryo storage. And I think, for people living in Alabama, let's just go out on a whim and just say, hey, this is something that's gonna stick for a little while. How do they start thinking about those embryos that they have stored in Alabama? I mean, some people are going to start asking, do I need to move my embryos? Do I need to consider having my embryos in a state that doesn't have these laws? I don't think I have a good answer for that yet. I'm just kind of putting it out there.
yeah. I mean, I don't, like you said, I agree. And I honestly feel like if we did this again next week, we're gonna have a whole bunch of other things to talk about. Yeah, I was even thinking about. You're right. I mean, the place is getting locked down. I don't know what happened there, but what if it was malicious, right? I mean, it's weird. The implications of this are really severe. And I think it's scary because, like I said, if this gets to the Supreme Court and they say, yeah, that could be considered a human, I mean, I don't even know how our field survives anymore, other than the fact that it goes back 10, 20 years back to ways, like you said, the way it used to be. And I just, I really hope that this is where, again, I'm surprised by those judges that, realizing this wasn't a simple decision and that it had so much implications. Again, I hope it doesn't move forward. I know
Yeah,
we've kind of talked about it. I'd love to know. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say,
What were
as
you saying?
context, you were talking about when this law was created. Obviously, no IVF babies back then, and now in the U.S., we're seeing, anywhere between 1% and 2% of all live births in the country are born via IVF. So this affects a very, very significant part of our population and the new population, the population of children that are coming into the world in this country. So yeah, I think this is, sometimes we forget how big or how many people or how common IVF is. But yeah, we'll definitely be happy to take some questions if you want to transfer over to that, Dr. Amos.
Yeah, so let's. I think Jess here actually had a specific question about that. So I'm gonna put you on. I know you don't want to be seen, and that's fine. Just keep your camera off, and we're gonna get you on the stage here, Jess. And so we can't see you, but if you want to ask your question live, Jess, you're live with us.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just wondering how this will affect people who, have embryos right now within the New Direction clinic. Do you guys have a plan if Arizona follows suit and, makes this makes embryos children essentially?
Yeah. So interesting, Jess. When the whole Supreme Court part with Roe v. Wade went down, everyone had to think about these decisions right away. So we had to actually think about this a long time ago. And at that time, we thought it might just be like a local thing. So there are certain states, one of them being Nevada, I know of, that actually have constitutional law that protects us in this situation. So our what we would do is we would move the embryos off off of Arizona and bring them to Nevada. And then what we would do is every time someone needs to do a transfer, we would then transfer the embryo back to Arizona, thaw the embryo, and put it back. So it's from the frozen part, as long as there's still states, I'm actually more concerned if it even gets further than that, we don't know 10 years from now, there could be a president who goes and decides that, wants to pass a law that says all embryos have things. And then that's a federal law. And then that over goes to states. But we have thought about it. Right now it'd be Nevada. But the question would come into is what will be the downside effects? Like let's say if Arizona passes that, what if we drop them? What if something goes wrong? That's also some of the other fears that we're worried about with these frozen embryos. The storage. So one of the patients brought up is transportation. Who's going to want to transfer them, right? So now you're going across state lines. Is there going to be put them at risk? And I think that's the part that no one's even thought of yet. How's it going to affect the transportation companies? What do you think, Dr. Salem? I mean, what do you think about Jess's question there?
It's a great question, and I mean super valid, and definitely something that people are already thinking about. And you're right. Like I think a lot of people are already thinking about this at the time of Roe v. Wade. And when we look back at Roe v. Wade, our experience there is that the initial reaction might have been an over response. Some people got really freaked out and spooked, and they were moving embryos out of Texas and moving them to California, and the reality is, fortunately, it didn't affect anything, and people have been going about doing IVF just as they always have there. And so I think that if that's an early policy lesson for all of us, it's that we really have to wait for the dust to settle on these things before we make any decisions. This is the type of thing also where, practically speaking, I mean, there are a lot of embryos frozen everywhere. And so it would be, very difficult to imagine that there wouldn't be some significant grace period by which people would be allowed to kind of transition things or move things in and out. So I don't think this is ever going to be an emergency thing where people find themselves having to very quickly transfer embryos in or out of state. But just like you were saying, Dr. Amos, I think that this presents a logistical nightmare for us because people, you know, which has always been the case in women's health, you know, will kind of find a way to deliver care. We will. And it's just about, you know, kind of how much red tape one has to go through. And if it requires transferring embryos back and forth between places, that will be done. It's just that hopefully it doesn't need to be done because it increases risk, it increases cost. It's, you know, it's just a lot of logistical pain. So I don't foresee this happening, you know, anytime soon. But of course, I'm not a policy expert. I'm not a lawyer.
Jess, any follow-up question to that? Otherwise, we'll kind of keep talking about it. Do you have any other follow-up questions to that?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being on here. So,
yeah.
You know, I think one of the things that will happen, and again, I would hate for this to happen, but I mean, just like kind of abortion has happened, right? There's going to be states that are more pro and some are not. I mean, I hate to think we're going to get to a point where there are states that are more pro-reproductive. I mean, and again, I really see this as something where I don't get into that stuff a lot. I feel like people should, think what they want, but this is one I don't think is very supported. I could see a state really, I mean, losing almost their identity and being voted out, a lot of people, for something like this, because most people agree that people should be able to have children. I mean, it's just like I said. I'm pretty sure this is going to be overturned. I'm hoping it actually gets a special session, in the Supreme Court or something, or even federal court, just to get overturned, because this is, like I said, a very shocking thing. Yeah, I mean, what could you do thinking about this? Let's say someone has embryos in Alabama right now. They're freaking out, right? And I think a fair thing to freak out. That's the same state that actually talked about putting charges against people who left the state to have abortions. So are they going to charge people trying to move the embryos or something out of the state? Like, again, it's a very aggressive state when it comes to conservatism there. And so anyways, just thought about that. That's the same state that actually was thinking about doing that. Well, I know we've beaten this horse a lot, so I'm more than happy to answer questions all night about this. So if anyone has questions, please put them through. But let's pull up Ari, and then we'll start answering some of the other fertility questions as well. Okay. Hey, Ari.
Hey. So we have some questions in the chat. Lauren is okay to come on. She just doesn't want to show her face. So we can bring her up if she's ready.
It says she's disconnected, so I don't think we can.
Oh, no. Okay, Lauren, try to see if you can connect, and then we'll bring you on. Let's go over to our Facebook and our other social media. So we have some stars in the chat for some questions. So we have Lasagna. I don't want to butcher that. She asked a couple of questions. She said, how can one have a baby after 6 years? So I guess she's referring to them being in storage currently.
Yeah, so why don't we answer that, and then hopefully Lauren can connect again, and we can get back to her.
Yeah.
You want to start that one, Dr. Zalem?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So, I mean, if I could kind of like rephrase the question, maybe the question is, how can you freeze your embryos and then from that same embryo 6 years later, have a baby? And this is one of the beautiful things that's happened in our field. And there's been incredible technological innovation in the field of what's called vitrification. And vitrification is where the embryo, which is in a liquid state, mostly because it's water, is turned immediately into a solid glass-like state. And we'll ignore the biology of this and all this kind of stuff, but suffice it to say that one of the amazing things about this process of cryoprotection is that when you then go to thaw that embryo, it thaws at a very, very high rate, and the cells start to now divide again. So the cells are arrested for a long period of time, potentially 5 years, 10 years, and then that embryo will start dividing again and can lead to a pregnancy. So there can be a 6-year delay in this case, for example, between when you froze the embryo and when you put it back in, and yet the embryo is still only 5 or 6 days old, if you will. And this has like been one of the huge innovations in our field that allows people to bank extra embryos and then go back. And many times from just one IVF cycle, they might have 2 children, maybe even 3 children sometimes from just one IVF cycle if they had a bunch of embryos frozen there. So I think that's what the question was getting at. And I hope I answered your question there.
Yeah. And I think there's actually a lot of studies being done on this right now is how long can this embryo be frozen for? And so one thing that Dr. Salem mentioned was there's been a change. So in the past, we used to do slow freezing, which is where we used to freeze over time. And then the purpose of that is to prevent crystal formation. So as everyone probably knows, water, as it gets colder, it expands, which then that's why its density is less and it floats on top of water. And that's why ice floats. The problem is those crystals destroy the embryo. And so for years, we actually used to freeze embryos at the PN stage, which is the day right after fertilization, because some of them had like less water contents and things like that, and they froze better. Some places even used to freeze even at morulus because, again, less water content. When you become a blastocyst, you have this big old fluid-filled center, and that fluid-filled center can get crystallization. So what's unique about vitrification, as he said, it becomes a glass-like state. So instead of not freezing, you're removing most of the water, you're putting lots of solutes in there, and then you rapid freeze it. And so the question about after 6 years, can you do it? The answer is yes. We don't think there's any issue. There has been many pregnancies from embryos that have been frozen for 6 years. Just my clinic alone has been over 10 to 12 years. I'm trying to think of probably 15 years, probably the most right now. But if that's part of the question too, I just wanted to help answer that. We'll go back now. It looks like Lauren is back on. So let's pull Lauren to the stage. Lauren, are you there?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Hey, thanks for being on here. We really appreciate it. We know no one wants to show their face, so that's good. That way, at least you can still be honest. We appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. I guess my question is, if an immature egg from an egg retrieval matured in a lab's petri dish for 1 to 2 hours later, realistically, how likely is that egg still able to result in a live birth? Should I just ignore those when they say you should freeze X amount of eggs? Should I just ignore those eggs that needed extra time in the lab? Or are they reliable or not really?
Just for clarification, so I make sure Dr. Well, Salem, I have same thing. When you're saying, so there are 2 types of immature eggs, and I think sometimes these get a little bit confusing. There's what are called GVs, and then there's an immature egg. And a GV is a very immature egg, meaning like if I just took a needle and stuck it in your ovary and pulled out an egg, I could actually grow that then in a petri dish till the next day until it's mature and then can fertilize it. Versus an immature egg, it's just something where it will eventually mature, but when we retrieved it, it wasn't ready yet. And it may mature in the next day, it may not. Are you talking about GVs, or are you talking about the immature eggs when you do a retrieval and some of the eggs aren't mature?
Well, I saw my embryology report. So some, maybe one of them was a GV, but the others were M1, and they did mature in 1 to 2 hours to become M2, and then they froze those. But one fertility doctor told me, he said, pretend they don't exist. And another fertility doctor said, no, they're still pretty good. They still have a chance. So I guess I'm wondering about my probability with those eggs that needed help in the lab.
Dr. Salem, do you mind if I go first here?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
So first thing I can tell you is I'm not aware of a lot of data that talks about whether it matured an hour or 2 later. But what the data does show is when you have an egg, you do want to freeze it within a certain amount of time. And the longer that time is, the poorer the quality of those eggs will do. So most good clinics that freeze eggs are going to be freezing within the first couple hours. So you don't want to freeze them 8 hours later or anything like that. However, one thing that I'd love to ask Dr. Salem on this is, if it wasn't mature yet, though, how much effect does that have? And maybe he may have some information about that. I haven't heard anything specifically about it, but I do think there's at least a little truth to the fact that, yes, the longer you go out, they're exposed more. I don't know what the thing is, but I don't know what the science behind why freezing them later affects it, but that is true. And so I think that's what the other doctor is pointing to, is saying, hey, they're being frozen later. Those may not be as good. The question I don't know is, if it matured later, then does the time start from then, or does the time start from the point they're retrieved? I think it's from the time they're retrieved, from what I understand, but I'd love to even see Dr. Salem's view on this too, because that's a great question. I've never thought of that one.
It's a great question, Lauren. I mean, I'm going to kind of extrapolate out a little bit to some other, practical experiences that I've had and some research. So there are some places that will, in rare cases, do in vitro maturation of the eggs. And those are, again, like when they need a lot of time to mature, and then they kind of freeze them the next day. And so those eggs, the data would show that they have a much lower pregnancy rate than the eggs that are, frozen right away. But the difference of 1 or 2 hours, I don't know if there's any data that's out there that would tell us. It is interesting that they were able to catch that, like that from a practical standpoint too, in the lab. Like if they're looking at it as an M1, and then, are they checking in on it? Like, because they're not checking in on it every half an hour, of course. So it's just curious that they would have been able to kind of pick that up that quickly, but different protocols in different labs too.
Okay.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. I want to bring up a point Dr. Salem said. It's a really good point. Normally, when you get the eggs out, you look at them right away, but you don't freeze them right away. And so, you may look, let's say if you get 10 eggs, you go 4 of them are mature and 6 aren't. They don't just say, okay, throw the 6 away. What they do is they get everything ready, and then when they get ready to freeze, they look again. And at that point, let's say now 8 are mature. Statistically, your chance would be exactly the same, because they weren't going to freeze them anyways. It's definitely a very interesting question. So I'm wondering, do you know, Jess, was it something where like then they said we're going to hold them longer and then wait a few more hours and then freeze them? Is that what they did?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, just because we're confused on the part. Dr. Sam brings up a great point, is like at our lab, when we go to freeze them, if it's not mature, then it just doesn't get frozen. Now, some clinics will freeze immature eggs, because especially if it's like all you have, like let's say you're a cancer patient, you get 8 eggs, or like, listen, we're just freezing everything because they don't get another shot at this. But what's weird is at the point you would freeze, which is the safe point, that's really where that decision should have been made. So if it matured later, does that mean the lab watched it for a few more hours and then said, okay, now we're going to freeze it?
Yes, that's my understanding. I received the embryology report, and it said that and then I talked to one of the doctors, and it's my understanding they just put it in a petri dish. They didn't do anything to it. They didn't manipulate it or anything like that. And it eventually matured within 1 to 2 hours. And then they froze all the M2 eggs.
So I want to make
sure. It went from an M1 to an M2, and then they froze it with the rest of the ones that were mature upon retrieval.
Okay, so in the situation where if they were M1s when they were retrieved,
yes,
but they turned to M2s by the time you froze them,
yes,
at let's say the 2 hour mark,
yeah,
there should be no difference in those.
Oh, really?
From my understanding, there should be no difference in those. Now, if we're talking about they retrieved them, and the M1s will say when they retrieved, turn the M2s didn't turn the M2s at 2 hours. They went and froze those eggs and then watched the other ones for a few more hours. Those would have lower chances because they froze them later. So because we know that, like, if you go and you retrieve someone, let's say you give someone a trigger shot, if you retrieve them really early, those eggs do mature a little bit later. There's so many parts of this though too, like was a 35-hour trigger, a 36-hour trigger, was a 34-hour trigger. All those things play a little bit of part into it. But yes, if they were frozen within that time frame, which should have been in the first 2 hours, it should be the same. At least what the data shows. So
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm happy to hear that because I'm past the point of getting more eggs, and so I'm really relying on those frozen eggs.
do you mind if I ask, just because this is, how mature you are? Like, how old are you, and how many eggs you have frozen?
I'm almost 42, and I have, okay, so if we talk about mature upon retrieval eggs that were mature M2s right off the bat, I have 51 of those.
Oh, wow.
Okay, but I'm embarrassed to say this. It took me 10 egg retrievals to get there.
Well, I don't think anything embarrassing. I think,
Yeah,
if
no,
anything,
not at
it's
all.
just
I
a lot
mean-
of courage. I mean, look how brave you are to go through 10 cycles to get that. I mean, that's not
Absolutely.
embarrassing at all.
Thank you. So, but then I have like, I guess, 14, maybe 13 or 14 that were M1s that eventually matured within 1 to 2 hours that eventually became M2s. So
Yeah, I mean,
those are the extras.
I would feel pretty good about those, and I would feel really good about that big batch of eggs that you have, Lauren. I think you were probably counseled very, very well, and they said, hey, you're gonna probably need a lot of eggs, because many of them are going to be abnormal. And I mean, really kudos to you for your patience and determination in getting that. That's amazing, and I, for one, will be definitely rooting for every last one of those eggs for you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And one thing I don't know if you ever talked about this, Dr. Sam, it's kind of a great question. I love these questions. It makes me think of other things. One thing I get worried about, if I was a woman, obviously I'm not, but if I was, one of my fears would be with these eggs is I don't know your situation, but the partner you meet makes a difference. And so, Jess, something to tell you is, let's say you meet, some wonderful person or whatever you decide to use with their sperm. If their sperm is really bad, then the question is, I think you have a very difficult dilemma. And that dilemma is, do I use my eggs that I froze when now I'm going to have horrible rates because his sperm is bad?
Right.
Or do I make him now use donor sperm because I want to be able to have a kid of my own? And then if you try to do it with your eggs and you lose all your eggs, now you're using donor eggs with his sperm. It's, like I said, it's one of those things where I feel like, I don't know if your doctor spoke to you about that, but I always try to explain to people the number of eggs you need is a guesstimate. And it's based off your age, but it's also based off of the sperm. I mean, you can end up meeting someone who has severe sperm problems. And so definitely when you're ready to use those, make sure you talk to your doctor, whoever the sperm use you're using, just make sure you talk to them and do the best thing for you. But we'll definitely be praying for you and hoping everything goes well.
I'm trying to date and find someone, and to be honest, I am going to have them do a sperm analysis and DNA fragmentation test and go to a urologist because, I didn't do it 10 times for nothing. And it's important to me, obviously. I don't think anyone can deny that. And
that's why I'm looking out for you, telling you this.
So, yeah. I mean,
Absolutely.
I guess I'll just have to see how it goes, but.
Well, I have bad sperm, so I'm out of the running. So that's already there. But hopefully you can find someone wonderful. So
thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one. Yeah, it's interesting. When I talk to people about egg freezing, I go over that. I tend to not just think about it in the moment, and I do that with everything. Even when I talk to people about donor sperm, when I see a same-sex couple, I tell them, hey, let's not just worry about this pregnancy. What are we doing for our family? Do we need to have extra space for that? And I think when you think of egg freezing, it's so easy to just think about the number for you, but you're assuming that your partner is going to have good sperm. And if they don't, to me, that is a horrible dilemma to be in, because I can't imagine feeling like, do I give up my biology for my partner, or do they have to give up their biology, or do we take a chance? And the difference is, you take a chance with a woman and the eggs are gone. That's it. They're done. Yeah. The guy, though, he has forever to keep using. So to me, I feel like if I was in that situation, I was a female, I'd say, we're going to try once with donor sperm so I can make an embryo, make sure I have a kid on my biology, and then we can try with your sperm or something like that. But it's the tough one that
It's
they go on.
definitely a dilemma, but and especially on a night like tonight where we're talking about this case in Alabama, an egg freezing, and I think there's a lot of overlap there between the two of them. And my suspicion is we're going to see a lot of egg freezing in Alabama for at least the foreseeable future because of all these things that we're talking about. But just like you're saying, Dr. Amos, I mean, like if you freeze eggs, you're really far upstream from that transfer. And maybe you have poor quality sperm and you just don't know how low the fertilization will be downstream. And so, I just really feel for everybody in Alabama right now who's having to make these tough decisions and the patients in the clinics, because, they might end up having to freeze a lot of eggs. They go to thaw the eggs. By the way, a great thaw rate, for eggs is nowhere near a great thaw rate for embryos. Maybe about 90% thaw rate for eggs and about 99%, 98, 99% for embryos. So we're talking about very different, and I'm talking about thaw survival rates. So again, here's another little area where efficiency is going to get really hurt for folks in Alabama right now as they go through this. And again, it really relates to these comments that Lauren was making about egg freezing.
Yeah, and do you remember during COVID? I mean, this happened where when COVID happened, like these people in the middle of a cycle had to stop. I'm praying that this not happening to people in Alabama. I can't imagine if you're going through it, they're about ready, and they're like, listen, we got to stop right now. Hopefully they'll let them at least freeze eggs and they're just not going to initiate other ones. But what a great question. That was, I like that question. And, I hope anyone watching this realizes doing multiple cycles, you should never be ashamed of. I mean, there are some people who are lucky to get a bunch of eggs, but that is the definition of being brave and going through that. I don't have that type of courage to do that and go through 10 times. So, I mean, to me, that is nothing to be embarrassed about. That just shows your commitment. Let's pull Ari back up. I think we do have some more questions than people.
Hey, yep, we do. We have one from YouTube from Clay. It says, if an immature egg from an egg retrieval matured in the lab, petri dish 1 to 2 hours later, realistically, how likely is that egg still able to result in a live birth? And I think you guys touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, we basically, we definitely touched on that one. So I think that one was definitely talked about. Clay had a couple other questions I saw. One was, how many eggs should the average 37-year-old freeze for one potential baby? That's a pretty, I think it's a little subjective on that, but in general, if you're under 35, it's pretty clear that you need about at least 10 for every live birth you want. They're the same. I don't know what you've seen. I usually tell people by the time they hit 38, I'm wanting more like at least 12. By 40, I'm wanting, 40, 42, I'm wanting close to 15 for each live birth. And again, that it can fluctuate on the person because there's a difference between someone who is more mature and they're making the normal amount of eggs for them. So if someone's 40 and let's say they make, 12 follicles, everything goes well. To me, I'm not as worried, but someone who is 40, who's only making 3 eggs at a time because they have diminished ovarian reserve, that means their reserve is less than the next person. I'm giving one more eggs now. And so what do you think, Dr. Salem, on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a very long-winded answer for this, but I'll try to be brief about it. But, there are many ways to look at this. The first thing is whenever you get, a batch of eggs and you say, okay, let's say at the age of 35, we want, just for the sake of a round number, we want 12 to 15 eggs. Well, that correlates to some chance of having a baby. It's not 100%. I mean, most of the studies that have been done around this had to do all this kind of fancy mathematics. And what they show is like, you can kind of get to this point where you can tell a person you have an 80% chance of having a baby from this batch of eggs. So of course, 20% of people won't be in that lucky group. And I think that is the really tough conversation that every RE has to have with their patient is, hey, just remember, if we freeze the appropriate number of eggs, this is not a guarantee. Now, the flip side of that, which is the more fun conversation to have, is, oh, you did better than expected. You ended up with 3 euploid embryos, and now we have 2 babies from it. How great was that egg freezing cycle 7 years ago? And that's obviously the more fun conversation. But because these numbers in general are still small numbers, like we're still freezing, 10, 15, 20, 25 eggs. These are still relatively small numbers in the big picture of everything, that you can only be so confident that it's going to work. And I think it's an important conversation to have, and to have clarity around that.
Yeah. And like we talked about earlier, I mean, depending how the sperm, might be, I mean, that could affect how many you need. I mean, there's so many parts, and you're right. You're trying to predict what you'll need in the future. And the problem is that there's so many variables in the future that we just don't know yet. Let's get Ari back up. Perfect.
Hey, so we have Jennifer. She's here. She's ready to ask her question. I think she's going to keep her camera off.
That's perfectly fine. Hey,
Hi there.
Hey, Jennifer. How are you doing?
Pretty good. So my question was kind of going back to the Alabama ruling. I'm not sure what the implications would be for the discarding of abnormal embryos. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but aneuploids.
Yeah, you are.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think this is the part when we said in the beginning, like, I don't think anyone has a clue where this is going, because so technically, when we talk about aneuploids, technically there's always a potential that they can still become a live birth, right? It's very, very low. Most of the studies that I know of where they've actually done a blinded study where they went and they just had everyone, get pregnant, and then later unblinded it and found out embryos that were normal, embryos that were abnormal, who had a live birth. Those studies are showing that people aren't having live births with those abnormal embryos. But the definition of abnormal changes things as well. So I don't know really what would happen. So, for example, one clinic may call something abnormal because they use a criteria that calls it abnormal, whereas another clinic may call it super high mosaic. So, for example, let's say 90% of the cells are abnormal. Almost all clinics would call it aneuploid, but maybe some clinic now has a new category called super high mosaic. And so at that point, does that then consider, a death of a child now, because that had the potential for life, even though we know the statistics might be less than 5%? It is a great question, and I wish I had the answer for that. But right now, I think our heads are just spinning on the fact of what a wild ruling already. Sam, what do you think? I mean, like I said, that is, I think I agree with her that, yeah, I mean, even aneuploids start becoming an issue when you start thinking of the fact that if you're getting to the point that you're calling from 1872 that we meant embryos are frozen, which again, only 50% of embryos, if you're untested, even 135, are going to ever become a live birth. So it's important to understand that most embryos don't become live births that aren't tested. If they can make that jump and say that is a person when only 50% of them will ever even become a live birth, I don't think there's that far of an argument that they can make then that aneuploids could be covered under that. What do you think?
Yeah, it certainly opens the door for that kind of Pandora's box, right? I mean, they with this ruling, what they're saying is that any potential for a child is a child. That's kind of the way that I read it. Any potential for a child is already a child, and therein kind of falls under the legal system of being a child. And so that's how they've made this decision. And there are some many examples here where, if we're talking about, you can no longer discard an embryo. You can no longer discard an aneuploid embryo. And there's precedent for this. In other countries, they found themselves in a position where they had to transfer embryos that they knew were no longer dividing. These were embryos that were effectively,
Stalled.
they had stalled out and they were no longer showing signs of life, right? But they were in a position because they couldn't discard the embryo. They had to put the embryo back in. which is really unfortunate for that mother to be, because now, you know, she's exposing to herself to an additional transfer maybe, or to additional embryos being transferred. There's complications of just an embryo implanting, even when a good one implants. This idea of a vanishing twin, right? It affects the whole pregnancy. That's not fair to the pregnancy. So from a medical standpoint, this doesn't make any sense, but that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, I wanted to even go further than that. Before I do, I just want to make sure, Jennifer, do we answer your question? Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, you answered my question. I just think, like you said, it's a Pandora's box. Your mind starts kind of thinking about all of these other implications.
Yeah, absolutely. So where I was wanted to kind of to go with that a little bit, because we were talking about, you said like other analogies of that. I mean, it's so far off. I was thinking of the other day, I made the joke, actually, one of our groups, we have an REI group, and so there's a lot of REI doctors, and someone, when they talked about this, I said, are we going to start now arresting people who throw away seeds that make trees? Because technically the seeds will become a tree, and if you can't deforest them, then you're committing the same crime. It's so shocking, because let's even go to the point of, like, let's say someone's 48 years old. Someone who's 48 who freezes, let's say, an embryo, never puts it back, no testing. We don't even know that embryo is normal. The statistical chances that would ever be a live birth is so low. Yet, based off this law, it's considered a living human. And what's hard about our field, and I think this is something that a lot of people don't realize, and we have to always deal with, is that we're always trying to anticipate. So the reason why the pregnancy rate isn't 100% with embryos is because we don't know there's a problem. You and I get sick. I look really bad. I'm sick, by the way. But if I get sick, you're going to know I'm sick. You're like, Dr. Amos looks horrible. He's obviously sick. That's different than embryo. There's no telltale sign. The embryo doesn't hold up a flag. So the only way we know there's something wrong is we have to wait till the next day. But we don't have the next day to wait to. We can't just keep watching and watching until it's fully developed and go, oh, here's the baby, now put it in. And it's kind of like, like menopause. Like, people, am I in the menopause? I go, well, I won't know for a year, because you can't have a period for a year. And then we go, oh, guess what? You were in menopause. Now we know it. And so this is what's so crazy about this law, is that we are giving life to these embryos that there's no question they could be life. I don't want anyone here to think I'm saying that these embryos can't be life. Yes. But if you don't even test them, less than 50%, like 50% at best, are going to end up in live birth from people who are under 35. And so that means you would then be basically arresting people, or finding people that for something that won't even happen 50% of the time. And that's just the under 35. And so then you start getting into, like I said, the someone who's 47, how does that law apply? Because we just don't know. It's like when we're biopsying embryos and people say, well, biopsy the best ones on day 5. You're like, well, I can't. You might have better ones on day 6. We don't know what's going on with those embryos. And it's just unbelievable to be able to give almost, personhood to something that might only have 1% chance of ever becoming a human, or even 0%. And that's the part that's just crazy. I think, what was it? I forgot who the Supreme Court justice was one time, when they were asking her, I think they were asking her if, like, a man could be a woman, or someone, like, what was the definition of a woman? She goes, I'm not a biologist. Well, that's right. They're not biologists. So why are they making this type of decision? Like, that's the part that's crazy, is that why did these judges make this decision? They're not biologists. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand it. What a crazy, crazy decision. And the only thing I can think of is, and I don't know if you saw this, Dr. Salem, but I read something on the RA group that one of the people from Alabama said they didn't even know about this. Like, this just appeared out of nowhere. Usually these things are on our radar, right? So we got Resolve back there, which is a great organization, by the way. Everyone should support them. And they're always watching out for this stuff. And they're like, come to us and say, hey, do you guys know there's this law coming through? And then we start finding it. We talk to those legislators, and we say to them, guys, this makes no sense. Here's why, and why. Again, they're not biologists. I think what might have happened here, and again, maybe I'm wrong, this wasn't the community talking. This was a clinic versus a person, and then it worked its way up after getting dismissed by a lower court. And so no one knew about it. I mean, people from Alabama REI said they had no clue about this. So was there any biologist there talking about it? Was there anyone in there on our side saying, this is crazy, guys, you're being crazy, this doesn't even make sense?
Right. Yeah, certainly seems like it.
Yeah,
I will.
You see, I'm frustrated.
Well, it's very frustrating. And I saw a colleague of ours put a funny little note. So I'll end it on a lighthearted note. And he said, to all the folks in Alabama who have gone through IVF and have frozen embryos, you can now claim them as dependents on your taxes. So if you have 10 frozen embryos, well, at least you can claim those 10 embryos as dependents. So I don't know, that maybe that'll be enough to challenge the system over there.
It's a good point. It's usually when it starts affecting their pocketbooks, then they're like, okay, wait, we don't want to do this anymore. That's a good point. You definitely were kind of getting a little late here on time, and we will be doing this again in about 2 weeks. We already have the time set on the website. We may eventually even do it more. People really like this. People coming on is always great. We love hearing from people. So again, even if you don't show your face, just hearing the questions are more dynamic than just reading them. Before we go off, I don't want to make anyone mad, so we're gonna bring Ari back on. Ari, is there any questions out there that we're gonna get murdered for if we don't answer today, or just we've been talking about the Alabama thing so much?
Yeah. No, they're pretty much someone. Kara Vernon. She asked about. Do you guys see AI being incorporated in this process? I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if you guys want to close it off with that.
Yeah, I mean, she's been asking a lot of great questions. She's been asked like how often we discard embryos and stuff like that. Every clinic does that different. So, but I'm definitely more than happy to reach out to let them know how ours. I don't know how AI would be used in this. I don't know if you can think of a way, Dr. Salem, but yes, is AI going to be coming to fertility? Without question. It will happen without question. It's just the question is where, the efficiencies of it, the cost of it, but AI will be everywhere. I would love to even do a whole show about AI.
I was just going to say that's a great topic, and maybe we can tackle that one in a couple of weeks and talk about how, where we're seeing AI already emerging in our field and where we think there's value added already for patients with AI. I mean, we could do a whole intro session on that maybe in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I was going to ask one question. I think it's a good question. It was a really good one by Christina here. She was asking, because we were talking about eggs, how many eggs you needed to have a live birth. And she was mentioning a question about how many frozen embryos would you want someone to have? And so using that same part of 10 eggs, the thought is by 10 eggs, you'll have not just one embryo, but you'll have multiple embryos and have a chance of live birth. So when you actually buy donor eggs, you usually get like 6 or 8, and that usually gets you 1 or 2 embryos of transfer. So with 10, the thought is you'll have about 3, embryos, and from the 3 embryos, statistically, 1 of them might be genetically normal. The hard part with this question, and you can offer some other stuff they're saying, is age matters and stuff like that. So her follow-up question was, well, how many failed transfers would you recommend a patient stop doing transfers and move on to other options? It definitely matters because, there's good transfers, there's bad transfers. It depends if your transfers were difficult, and things like that. So that's a tough one to answer directly. But in general, I think the question you're asking is, if it takes 10 to get a live birth, how many embryos do you normally need a live birth? And that's a statistical question, what the chances are of that place. So there's like one clinic in the country has under a 40% live birth rate. Well, it's going to take 2 to 3 embryos to be able to come away with a higher chance of live birth. A place that has a 60% live birth rate or higher, you're going to have a higher chance per embryo. And so anything you want to add to that before we head off, Dr. Salem?
No, I mean, I think I think you summed it up perfectly there. I don't know how much more value I can add. I agree with that. I think it's ultimately like a very personalized decision-making process, and that communication between, each one of our patients and us, and understanding what our success rates are in our lab and in our clinic. And, those numbers, they really matter, because I think you're getting to the crux of this, which is that there's still quite a bit of a range between maybe the best performing clinics and the average and the lowest. So it depends.
Yeah. And there could be times with timing issues. There's other things that could be there. So one of the things I always make the point about IVF is both a test and a treatment. And so when it doesn't work, the question is, have you looked at all the other things? And so the only thing I'm going to end on, and I think this is, I don't know, in my heart, this is something important. I see our country constantly being divided, pro-choice, pro-life. I see people, I'm Democrat, Republican. And I think one thing that's really important is I do not want this to become another political point with regards to these embryos. This is about people with infertility. It affects more than 15% of the population. This should be more about just what's right, what's wrong, and coming to some type of compromise. I understand people have very deep morals that they believe in, but this is something where we're talking about people not having kids, not having a family. And that's the definition of life is procreation, to be able to have a family. And so I really hope, like I said, unlike some of these other things, this really does not become a political issue, because I find that sometimes political issues no longer become about the person, what it was about, but becomes about, I'm on team this, I'm on team this. And this should be, everyone should be on this team. No matter what your political views are, everyone should have the right to have a baby. And so I hope it's able to stay focused and we look at it from that standpoint.
Absolutely. I totally echo that. And I think, we certainly stand with all our couples, the women out there who are trying to do this, who are going through something that already takes a lot of courage to step up to the plate and go through fertility treatment. And the last thing that should ever be politicized is making it harder for couples that have already struggled with so much to go through this.
Yeah. Well, I had a blast. This is honestly so much fun. I even just like hanging out with you. I feel like we get to hang out more when we're doing these shows. So hopefully everyone's loving it. And please let us know, give us, some people give us some feedback. We took that feedback, we added it to this show. And if you guys have other feedback, let us know. We're more than happy to adjust. So anything you have to end on, Dr. Salem? I'll bring on Ari one last time, because as I always say, she's the most important part of this. She's the one that runs it. So let's bring her on and see if she has anything else for us.
Stop it. This is really fun.
Ari is amazing.
Like Dr. Amos was saying, and Salem, please keep sending questions. We love that. We keep them in a little archive for you guys, and we love your feedback. So let us know how you guys are liking the show. Share when you're watching it. There's like a little arrow that you can push. You can share it with all of your followers, and they can get some good information from these doctors. All right. We hope you guys enjoy, and see you next week or in 2 weeks.
Yep. See you in 2 weeks. Thanks again.
Take care. Bye, everybody.